Get ready for another informative, educational, and inspirational story on one of the hottest podcasts in the world. Forget what your clock says and get comfortable. It's time for another edition of It's Primetime Somewhere with your host, J.D. Williams. Now let's meet today's guest.
Well, thank you for joining us again for another edition of It's Primetime Somewhere. My name is J.D. Williams here in the Piney Woods of East Texas. And my guest today, and Edward, I don't know where you're joining me from. We'll get to that here in just a minute. But my guest today is Mr. Edward D. Gangi. And where are you at, Edward? Where are you located?
JD, it's nice to be here with you. I'm located in Hillsborough, North Carolina, which is the
beautiful
central part of the state. We're in basketball country here.
Oh, absolutely, and that's my sport. Actually, that got me into a lot of trouble when I was younger because I was pretty good at it. So anyway, that's a long story. Some of my audience members know it. But Edward, today we're going to be talking primarily about your book. And this is a book that, in my opinion, well, this is really close to my heart. I'll put it to you that way, and we'll talk about that as well. But Edward's book is entitled The Gift Best Given, a Memoir. And this is a story of adoption, search, discovery, and reunion set against the backdrop of the glamorous ice skating shows of the 1940s. And there you can see his contact information and website information. And, of course, we will be showing that throughout this presentation. Edward, I always ask this question of my guests, the very first thing, and that is, just who in the heck are you? Tell us about you. Who are you?
Well, thank you. I'm a 74-year-old about to turn 75.
God bless.
And I am the husband to my wife, Linda. We've been married for 36 years. The father to our son, James, who is now 32 and recently married. So we've inherited a new daughter, Renee. And I am the son to a set of parents who sadly are no longer with us. And as my book details, the son to another woman who gave me up for adoption at the time of my birth back in 1948.
Oh, God bless you. Well, that's the one thing we got in common, and we touched on it very, very briefly. I had spoken to Edward just for a minute, literally, before we got on here. We are both adopted children, and we're going to get into that as well because I think it's important. There's a lot of people out there that are adopted that struggle with that, and we'll talk about that as well. But, of course, I do want to get into your book specifically. So, number one, when did you come up with the idea of writing a book? Or was it something that was just going through your entire life history?
No, it sure wasn't. As I start the book, I said I never thought there was a story, and I certainly never thought I would be telling a story. But going back now, it's 6 years. I guess it's the winter of 2017. We were in a cemetery up in New Jersey where the family of my adoptive parents were all interred, and we were kind of standing there. And I'd known all my life that I was adopted. Mm-hmm. But I was standing over the grave of my adoptive grandparents on the maternal side, and they came from Ukraine back at the turn of the last century, back at the 1890s.
Wow.
And at that point, I had been reading a book called The Lost, and it was a story of a man who went on a search for 6 members of his extended family who were lost in the Holocaust. And, he knew obviously that they had perished because of the Holocaust, but he wanted the granular details. And fortunately, he had the resources to go and twice travel around the world looking for people who would have known his family and had come from that same town. And I'd been reading the book right at the same time we made this visit, and it inspired me to go back and start to look into their history And when I did that, and I realized that it was not terribly difficult to at least come up with the big facts, I started thinking, okay, I've never paid any attention to my adoption story. Maybe it might be similarly as easy to go back and look where I came genetically. Who was my biological mother?
Yeah. Well, again, we share that history of adoption. And just for those of you who are not really familiar with what it's like to be an adopted child, there are several decisions that have to be made. Number one, your parents have to make a decision as to when to tell you. Some people wait, and I think that is a terrible thing to do. Other people let you know early on. I was adopted at 3 days old, and as far as I know, I was told when on the day I was 3 days old that I was adopted, because I came up with that knowledge 100%, and then that really helped me out, as opposed to people who found out when junior high and high school, who went through a very traumatic experience of, okay, you've lied to me all my life. You're finally telling me the truth, or are you? You also have the where did I come from? Am I some politician's throw-off kid? From some type of a situation. Am I related to the King or Queen of England? Or am I related to Charlie Manson? Who am I related to, and why did my mom give me up for adoption in the first place? That's a big one. That person kind of looks like me. I wonder, could that be my brother? Where did I come from? Who did I come from? Why am I here? I mean, there's a million questions, right, Edward?
There are, and you and I are very similar in that you went home with your parents at 3 days. Mm-hmm. I went home at 1 day. And I smiled a little bit when you said that, as far as your parents started telling you right from that time. What I have been told is that the doctor who delivered me told my adoptive mother to hold your baby and tell him you're our wonderful adoptive baby and I love you. Mm-hmm. And I don't recall that, but again, it's certainly at a day old you don't, at 2 days or 3 days. And, at whatever point it might have been where I had that recollection, I have a feeling my mother stopped. Because I never remember a conversation where my parents looked at me and said, "You're adopted." But
I don't either.
I think someplace in my heart I knew. And I always tell the story that, I was one day when my parents were out going through some of their papers and found the papers surrounding my adoption. Oh. And, I was young, but I looked at them and I knew what they meant. I may not have understood the legalese and such, but I understood what they were saying. And I just put them back away, and I never brought them up with my parents because I sort of made the decision that if they were not making this a current discussion, then maybe I shouldn't either. But I never had a question but that I was adopted. I knew from a very early age.
Yeah. Well, my parents told me flat out. And like I said, it by the time I had an understanding of what it really was, it no longer mattered. I was
exactly.
I knew I was adopted. I didn't think it was any big deal, and I went on about life. There was never an issue. The one thing I did have all those questions that I talked about earlier. I mean, I think that's just normal thing. And I did go on a search for my family, which ended when I was 18 years old. By the way. Kind of started and stopped right about the same time. I knew I really couldn't do anything before I was 18, but when I was 18, I actually met the judge, the actual judge that did the adoption, and she couldn't tell me anything. She told me that she knew who my birth mother was and she'd be in touch, and if maybe they wanted to get in touch with me, fine. Nothing came of that, and decades went by. So that was my story. And I don't know how yours was, but you can fill in the gaps there.
Well, I had a similar story, JD, in that I was adopted. I knew it. I was comfortable with that. Adoption was a part of my life. It wasn't my consuming life.
Right.
And I just sort of went through and quite honestly had no compelling desire to find out. Probably once, twice a year, and I'm guessing at that. I might have had the passing thought of, gee, I wonder who the woman was that placed me for adoption and why. And I made the assumption she was a high school girl who, quote unquote, got into trouble. And, as one of those women in that baby scoop era, was probably shipped off someplace to have her baby. Baby was taken from her, and then she came home, and her life went on as normal, and mine went on as on some different track. Virtually never thought about who my father might have been. It just wasn't of any real importance, because I guess I sort of thought I was an accident, an accidental pregnancy, and who my father was didn't much matter.
Yeah.
And
I now have contact with my birth mother. Closer than that. She's my mom, but but my adopted mom will always be my mom. Now they have both passed away. Both my adoptive parents have passed away, but my mother is still alive. She lives in Iowa, which is some distance from where I am here in Texas. But we visit on occasion. And as I said, I've got a lot of brothers and sisters, which I didn't grow up with. That was kind of new and different there. But tell us about the book. What caused you to write it, and who did you write it for?
Well, when I started this journey, and again, it was just, I dialed up Ancestry.com one day. I had a piece of paper that had a strange name on it, and instinctively I knew it had to be my birth mother. And, I put it in, and the information started coming to me. And I started to solve a puzzle, and it really was a puzzle. And I found out that my birth mother had been a celebrity performer in the big ice skating shows in the 1940s and the 1950s, and that she had become accidentally pregnant, basically sequestered herself. She hid out, and no one knew except for her eldest sister and her sister's husband. And she managed that pregnancy and my adoption, and then went right back to performing again. And as I started to gather all of this information, I started to sort of write down what my process was of just discovering my story. And it was interesting. The ice skating piece was extremely interesting. What I found out about some of the people she knew was interesting. And my wife was very supportive in saying, you should really get this on paper. And I started to attend a memoir writing class at one of our local libraries. And there was a very supportive environment there. And then I had another friend who has a number of published books over a variety of subjects, and he was fascinated with the ice skating and show skating industry. And he kept on saying, you need to write a book. And the book that emerged was not the one he was thinking about, but it was a book nonetheless. But I think in the end, the story that I wrote was for me. It recorded, and I think for my family, for my wife, and for my son especially, because one day I won't be here, and I think it's an important enough story that he needs to have hold of it.
Yeah.
And so I started to write, and I had two pieces. One was basically the journey that I went on and the encounters that I had along the way. And the other part was what I discovered. It was who my mother was, who my birth mother was. And as I said, she was not that high school girl. She was a 23-year-old woman who already had a public persona. And after she managed my adoption, went on and traveled across the United States and South America and the Caribbean and Europe, and had a very, very interesting life. And I put the two of those together, and out of that emerged a book.
Wow. Well, another thing that adoptive kids hit, for those out there that aren't familiar with this, is there are times in your life when you go to a doctor and they want to know about, okay, well, tell me about your family history here. How is this, is your family, prone to having this type of cancer or this type of thing here, high blood pressure, whatever the case may be. And you got to look at that doctor and say, I have no idea. Not the slightest clue. I'm an adopted child and I don't know. By the way, for those of you that are not talking and telling your kids about adoption, realize that question is coming. A doctor is going to ask you that in front of your child, and if that happens and you don't have the answer, your child is going to look at you and wonder why you don't, and also start questioning your honesty. So again, another reason, I'm going to emphasize this a couple of times during this broadcast, Edward, that I think it's important that people do let their children know that they are adopted children.
Well, I think you're exactly right. I think that's a twofold answer. I think one is certainly the right to know what your medical history is. Right. And I was like you. I was very comfortable looking at a doctor and saying, I don't know, I'm adopted.
Right.
But, as far as the message to the parents out there is, if you don't tell your children, at some point with all of this recreational DNA testing that's readily available, there are no secrets.
Right.
You may try to keep it a secret for whatever your motivation might be, but that answer is going to pop up in probably sooner than you imagine, and you'll be questioned. And just like you said, your honesty and their ability to count on you for the truth is going to come into question.
Right. I mean, it is going to be found out. I guarantee you.
Yeah, there are no secrets anymore.
Right. And, be honest with your kid. That's all I can tell you. That's the very best thing that you can possibly do, in my opinion anyway. And that has been my experience, and I have counseled a lot of adopted kids in my life that found out about it at a later age, including my best friend at about high school level, who was very, very concerned there as well. So tell us a little bit more about the book. Just kind of kick in wherever you want it. Where does it start, and what is it? Just tell us a little bit about it.
Well, the book starts with me standing in a cemetery in New Jersey in February of 2017 and getting that the impulse to start doing some research. It moves back here to North Carolina. And I went to the public library where they had Ancestry.com available. I took that piece of paper which had the unknown name on it, typed it in, and sort of sat over the keyboard with my finger saying, do I really want to do this? And I did, and I got a screen full of listings for census records and birth records and the like. But the one that I decided to click on it from the start was a travel document, an application to travel from Miami to Rio de Janeiro about 9 months after I was born. And this was my birth mother's name. And I said, okay, 9 months is interesting. And why would she have been going to Rio? And I clicked on it, and it was written in Portuguese, but completed in English. And it gave me information I was already pretty much aware of, but it listed two things. It listed her profession as an artista. It listed her birth date as 1925. So the thought of her having been that high school girl who got in trouble went out the window when I realized that, doing the math, she was 23 when I was born. And then probably the most significant of all was a picture of her staring back at me. It's kind of a black and white passport photo. And I sat there looking at it and said, that's the woman who gave birth to me. And that was really kind of I wouldn't say it was earth shaking, but it made me make me take a deep breath.
Absolutely. Well, you had a lot more information than I did because my adoptive parents, they were very open with me, and they said that I had a brother and a sister that they knew of. And as it turned out, yeah, there was a brother and a sister, all right, but there was a bunch more that came after that. And the circumstances of my situation, as far as why I was adopted, was because of the dad that was involved, and he just happened to be in prison at the time that I was born, and my mom wanted me to have a good life. The other kids were basically trapped in a very bad life, and she wanted me to have a good one. And that was the reason for my adoption. I didn't know all that. I had no idea. Like I said, there was an aunt that popped up out of nowhere in my 40s telling me that she'd kept up with me all my life and that she knew that there was a sibling that eventually one of my siblings was going to find out about this and want to get in touch, and that had happened. And it was up to me whether or not I was going to make contact with that sister that was making the inquiry. I had closed the book on it, I had moved on, and it took me about a day to say, yeah, if I don't, I'll always wonder. So anyway, that's my backstory, and I don't know how similar that is to yours, but it sounds like you had a lot more information. My adoptive parents, they didn't even have the last name right, of the person. They didn't even know that.
Yeah, it's interesting. My adoption was privately arranged. And that in itself was a kind of a remarkable story with people knowing people. Somebody, my birth mother's brother-in-law, knowing somebody who knew somebody else who was looking to adopt a child.
Right.
And and those pieces came together kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. And interestingly, as far as documentation goes, my adoptive parents forever kept the documentation of my adoption, the adoption decree and such.
Yeah, I don't ever remember seeing anything. And you've mentioned that now a couple of times, and and my parents didn't hide anything from me ever. I mean, they were very open about any kind of question I had. They answered it to the best of their ability every single time. But I never saw any paperwork.
Those papers were not typically available to anyone, any place.
Yeah.
They were typically, I don't know where you were adopted, but they were locked up by the state, and they
Texas.
were put away. They were put away and said, none of your business, no one's business. And ostensibly, I guess, to protect the birth mother.
Yeah.
But, because of the private nature of the adoption, and somebody, I guess, had enough influence, my adoptive parents wound up with a copy of that paperwork. The other thing that was interesting was in January of 2020, New York State, where I was adopted, had forever, or since 1937, sealed its adoption records.
Right.
So you could get an amended birth certificate, which essentially told you nothing. You could get non-identifying information, which again told you pretty much nothing. But starting in January of 2020, those records got open, so you could apply for your original birth certificate. And I did that, having already, discovered my story and found all the detail that I thought was appropriate. And I'm glad they waited so long to open the records, because when I got my original birth certificate, if I had started there, I would have gone off on a wild goose chase, because my mother's name as it was listed was incorrect. Her home address it was listed was incorrect. Her occupation as it was listed was also incorrect. and I found out later that was all done basically to protect her identity as as a person in the public eye.
Yeah. Yeah.
She gave birth to me in a private hospital that catered largely to people who needed, discretion. Mm-hmm. So those things are all intentionally, incorrect. But if I had started there, I wouldn't have known where to go.
Yeah. Well, I knew. Mine was in West Texas, and so I knew the town. And as I said, I went out there. I was 18 years old. I went out with my best friend. We were actually doing had a DJ company one of those portable DJ companies,
Right.
in college and that type of thing. And we were going to do a show out in West Texas. We actually went to the town where I was born, and we were going to do a show there. And I said, okay, well, what the heck? I'll go to this county office and find out. And sure enough, it was the same judge. I knew the judge's name, and when we walked in, the judge was still serving. I mean, now she was old, but she was still serving. The Justice of the Peace, or whatever she was, I think it was Justice of the Peace, county clerk or something. And she couldn't tell me anything. She knew me. I mean, she knew my family really well, but she couldn't tell me anything because the records were sealed.
Right.
But that was the moment that I closed the door. I'd always wondered about it, but I have this unique ability. If I want to just do away with something, I can cut it off in my mind and I'm done with it. I don't think about it anymore. And that's what I did with the adoption until at least 20 years later, when I've got this mysterious aunt calling me and telling me who she is and who I am and where I came from and knows all about me. It's kind of a shock, Now,
you can't resist that, though.
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy. I mean, I was even do you remember the Montel Williams show? They even contacted me about getting on there, and the only reason that we didn't do it is because we couldn't get enough family members to join in the thing. So anyway, just a side note there, kind of crazy. But anyway, I do want to make sure that everybody has information on where they can get your book before this first half of the podcast runs out. So tell us a little bit about that. Again, the name of the book and where they can get a copy of it and any kind of contact information that you'd like to give them.
Sure. The book is called The Gift Best Given.
Okay.
I'm just trying to get you here.
Well, I'm gonna throw it up. How's that? I'll put it up there on the screen like that for you. How's that?
That works much better. The book is widely available. It can be ordered through any of your local independent bookstores if it's not there already. It's available via all of the online retailers. Amazon is certainly most people's go-to at this point.
Absolutely.
My website is there, degangiauthor.com, and if you'd care to have an autographed and personalized copy of the paperback, you can order the book there and pay via credit card. And the book is also available in digital format. For those who don't want to make the investment in the book, it's available on Overdrive and Hoopla through most public libraries. So it's out there and it's readily available if you'd like to see it.
Great. And we're going to talk more about the book in the second half of the podcast today. Y'all hang in there with us, and we'll be back after a very brief break for the second half of It's Primetime Somewhere.
Attention podcasters, influencers, media personalities, content creators, and aspiring or existing radio personalities. KRRB Revelation Radio now offers the opportunity to broadcast or syndicate both new or existing shows to all 50 states and more than 160 countries around the world. And if you currently operate a radio station, we offer you the opportunity to add several popular shows in virtually every genre for broadcast on your station. Choose programming from 30 minutes to 2 hours, with each internationally syndicated show adding quality content sure to grow your listening audience. We even have excellent optional services to help you promote your show or station. These services are not only designed for audio use on the radio, but also include tools for use on social media, even YouTube. For more information, visit www.revelationradio.net or email the Ustreamit LLC Broadcast Network at office@ustreamit.net today.
Welcome back, everybody, to the second half of It's Primetime Somewhere. My name is J.D. Williams, and again, I am joined there in North Carolina, I believe he said. That is really God's country up there, Edward, and I'm not gonna butcher your last name. So I'm gonna let you reintroduce yourself, and then we're gonna get back more back into your book.
JD, thanks. I've been enjoying the conversation. I'm Edward D. Gangi, and I come from Hillsborough, North Carolina. And speaking of God's country, we lived down in Houston, Texas for 12 years back in the late 1980s into the 1990s. And our son was born there. We started the earliest years of our marriage there, and we've got a real fondness for Texas.
Yeah, well, I was in the airline industry, so I have been to every state, every state in the country, and most countries around the world. I can tell you that. But home has always been Texas. Yeah.
Actually, it was the airline industry that brought me to Texas. I worked for Continental Airlines for several years.
Okay, competitor there, because I worked for American Airlines. The old AMR Corporation is who I worked for. I actually, I started out really in the, on the ramp throwing bags and ended up in headquarters. I'll put it that way. So anyway, long career, enjoyed it a lot, and took advantage of all those flight privileges, as I'm sure you did.
Absolutely.
When you can fly that cheap, it's pretty cool. Okay,
it's a hard thing to do anymore.
Yeah. So let's get back into your book now, and where does it take off? Where does it begin? Childhood or?
No, time-wise, it basically, with my part of it, starts with the day I started looking. So it was my late in my adulthood search for the identity of my birth mother.
Okay.
And it tells my story starting in that February of 2017 up in New Jersey. And the piece that deals with my birth mother begins with her leaving home in New York City in 1942. She was 17 years old, and her parents, remarkably, let her get on a train in Grand Central Station in Midtown Manhattan and travel alone across the United States to meet up with an ice skating troupe in Vancouver, British Columbia, and that's where her professional career began. So it traces her life from that time in 1942 through the time that she placed me for adoption in May of 1948.
Well, now, as I said, I have reunited with my mom, my birth mom, and have a very good relationship with her. But mine took place many years ago. There's, a couple of decades in here at least. Was your mom still alive when you went through this and found out who she was? Was she still living?
No, sadly, she was not. I started my search in 2017. As I said, I learned that my birth mother had passed away at the age of 88 in 2014. Okay. So I was a little bit late in getting started. It's interesting, I did reunite with a half-maternal sibling. So she got married 7 years after my birth. A year later, had her first son. And when we talked about it, and he said, "Aren't you sorry you waited so long?" I said, "Well, everything happens for a reason."
Right.
And he sort of shook his head. He said, "My mama always said that everything happens for a reason." So so I would very much have liked the opportunity, if only to say to her that you did something that worked out for the best.
Right.
Because I know that any woman who gives up a child for adoption has got to go through a very, very great amount of mental turmoil.
Right.
Just making the decision, and then afterwards wondering, I wonder if I did the right thing, and I wonder where he is and how he is.
Right.
And she could not have put me into a better place, and I so wished she had known that. I'd like to think that she does.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you on that situation, because I've again, having reunited with my birth mother, we have had many discussions since then on what her feelings were like after the fact, and what was going on beforehand. I gave you kind of a brief explanation of avoiding a bad life, mainly because my birth father, and I want to be careful here. I need to be careful here for personal reasons, and that is that I do have siblings that do watch this show, and I don't want to say anything that's going to hurt them.
Sure.
But it was a difficult, they came up in difficult circumstances, but they had a deep love for my birth dad that I never met. So I've got, again, I'm just trying to be very careful in my wording to where I don't make any of them or upset any of them. But
understandably so.
Yeah, but we are close. We are a family. We are close. We've been together now for several years, and my adoptive parents always supported the idea of me finding them, and I did that before they passed away. But those adoptive parents are my parents. They will always be my parents. My birth mother is my birth mother, and she will always be my mom too. So it's a real unique situation here, and I wish you had had a chance to talk to your mom, because I'm sure there was a lot of things that she would have loved to have talked to you about. But did the idea of the book come up immediately when your search started? Did it come up when the search ended, or somewhere along the way, or what?
Yeah, I would say somewhere along the way. It's
Okay.
when I started discovering more about my mother's story that I started to write her story as well as mine. And the book, I think, is very accurate in terms of where my mother was and who she was with at any given point in time. Certainly what was said and what was thought. That's all the best that I could put together, and just trying to make sense of the story. But so I wound up with two stories: my story and her story. And originally, when I conceived of a book, I thought of a part one, my story; part two, her story. And when I gave it to an editor, they came back to me and said, it's kind of a bumpy transition there. Why don't you take these two stories and kind of interleave them, and take a little of yours, a little of hers, and that's what I did. And now it flows quite smoothly, and I think it's a very natural, it's a very natural telling of our story, not just mine, not just hers.
Right. Was it a way of healing in any sense? And by that I mean, as an adopted kid, we all had the same thing. We all go through the same thing of wondering what in the heck, what happened. How did you deal with it emotionally? I guess is the best question.
As I went through my life, my early years, and I say early years, I guess was right up to the time I started to search, I really didn't have an emotional response to being adopted.
Right.
It was just a fact of life, and
right.
And kind of like you said, I have a way of compartmentalizing things. I was adopted. That went in one compartment. I had a life that needed to go on. It went in another compartment. But I think as I started to write the story, particularly her story, that's where the emotions came at. And the emotions were more about, what she experienced as a mother giving up a child than it was about me being the child who she was giving up.
Right.
And there really were moments when I sat over it in the time, where she was coming to a decision, and the time where she was relinquishing, that I literally sat there with tears in my eyes.
Yeah.
And it was not feeling bad about me. It was sympathizing with her.
Well, did you have an opportunity to meet anyone that knew your mom?
I did. I had several. Well, I shouldn't say several. I had a number of opportunities. Maybe the most interesting was in determining. If you'll remember, I said I discovered my birth mother was an artista.
Right. You need to kind of describe that too. Exactly what that is.
It took some time to kind of do some research and find out that she was a performer, and I found that out when I discovered her marriage license from 7 years later, and it listed her husband's name, and it listed her as a performer. And having her married name having performer, having, I found she had changed her name, adopted a screen name or a publicity name.
Right.
Starting to type that in, I found out, I came up with a lot of information, and she was Genevieve Norris, ice skater. And I found some people who had been to an auction one day who had purchased a box full of her memorabilia, of ephemera, and we made contact with them, and they were wonderful. They were so generous. We met them in Atlanta, and they just pushed the box across the table and said, "Here, we've just been holding this for you."
Wow.
And in that box was a stack of publicity photographs of other ice skaters who basically personalized them to my mother, Genevieve, and one of them said to the most wonderful roommate ever, Izzy. And I found out who Izzy was, and I started looking for her, and I found an obituary for a man who turned out to have been her late husband. And it didn't give any information about her, didn't say whether she was alive or not, but I had listed her sons' names, and I found one of the sons and reached out to him, and he said, "Yes, Mom's still alive, and I've shown her the information that you sent me, and she would really love to talk to you." And I was pretty excited. He said, "Just one thing, Mom is in a memory care facility."
Oh, okay, yeah.
He said, "But that's not such a bad thing." He said, she's not too sure about what she had for lunch yet today, but she can tell you all about 1947.
Isn't that something? That's what,
Yeah.
I've seen that so many times where, you can remember things that happened at a certain point earlier in your life, but you have a really difficult time in the here and now.
And that's typical with Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And I had a lengthy telephone conversation with her, and she could not have been any more charming and told me lots of things. And a couple of months later, my wife and I flew out to Minnesota, and we went to visit with her. And we had a 5-hour visit, and she could not tell me about who my father was, but she told me so much about my mother and the kind of person she was. And she said, "I can't believe she did what she did if she knew she was pregnant," because my mother was one of those acrobatic skaters, and she was in the type who got spun and thrown But yeah, so she was probably the most informative and the most entertaining. But I've met some people via social media who knew her. I met another woman down in Georgia where my mother ultimately lived, who had actually purchased some things that my mother had and her husband manufactured. After skating, they both went into manufacturing props for the big ice skating shows and theatrical events. And this woman was very free in sharing her information, and she had actually dated one of my half siblings. And she said, "I've still got these two things together, these two things that I purchased from your mother. Here, you take them." Mm-hmm. And they're hanging up in the garage right now. So,
wow.
And I've met 1, 2, 3 of my first cousins. There's a fourth cousin out there, and my first question to all of them has been, "What do you know? What did you know about my being adopted?" And they also said nothing.
Nothing.
If anyone in their family knew about an adoption, the whole family would have known.
Yeah.
And so, it just reaffirmed that, my adoption was a secret. It was a carefully kept secret. My mother came from a very traditional, conservative, Polish, Roman Catholic family, and her coming home pregnant would have been the ultimate in shame for everybody. Yeah, so she just didn't go home.
Well, my mom is from a family of 14, believe it or not. There's the top 7 and the bottom 7 was the way it was described to me. So the ones that are in the top 7, they're close to each other. The ones that are in the bottom 7, they're close to each other. And the other way, it doesn't really, they don't really mesh. They're brothers and sisters, but they don't really talk a lot or whatever. But one of the sisters of my mom kept track of everything. And then my older brother and older sister knew of me and knew it was a secret and knew it was to be kept a secret, because if my birth dad had found out about it, it could have been a very bad thing for my mom, and had I showed up, it would have been a bad thing for me too.
Yeah.
So they were aware of it, and that helped in the long run when we were putting everything together for my family, my brothers and sisters, and all that. The reconciliation, or whatever you want to call it, the getting back together thing. Now, you mentioned some half-brothers, half-sisters. Do you have relationships with these people, or is it just kind of passing, or what?
No, I do. I discovered in my search that even though my mother had passed away, I discovered that she had 2 sons after she got married. One of them, unfortunately, passed away under very unfortunate circumstances. The other one, I'm in frequent contact with, and it's interesting. 2 people could be no less alike than he and I. So there's always that discussion of nature and nurture, and I think nurture in this case probably overwhelmed nature. But nice person. He had, when I originally approached him, he just could not fathom that he and I were, had shared the same mother. And it did take some time, and and once I had proven it to him,
right,
he was fine.
Full acceptance.
Things were good.
Yeah.
At the time I started my search, or actually even before I started my search, just to find out what my ethnicity was, I had submitted a DNA sample to Ancestry, and several months later got back a piece of paper which gave me my pie chart saying you're 50% this and 30% that. But they also send you a list of all of your relatives. It had 2,000 cousins, but at the top of the list was the name of somebody who ultimately turned out to be my paternal half-brother. And so that led me to the identity of my father. And my understanding, my belief is that he never knew that I existed. He and my mother had a summer romance. She left town, never looked back. And at the time that they had their relationship, he was between the second and third of 5 wives.
Oh wow!
So he was a romancer. My half-brother, when I spoke with him initially, and it sounds, a good deal like your story may have been, is he said, he told me, and he was very candid. He said, "I'm not sure who the people were who brought you up. Chances are good, though, that you did better with them than you would have had my father been your father." Yeah. And that's such a sad thing to hear.
It is,
but it was very candid and very forthright. He and I met. He lives in San Francisco with his family, and probably a year later, we traveled to San Francisco to meet him. And he was, he said, "If you wouldn't mind, my mother, and this is mother or wife number 3, would like to meet you." And she at first was very concerned about the timing with all of this, but when she realized that her relationship with my father started, after that that summer romance occurred, she was good with it, and she we went out to visit with her, and she basically said, "Sit down. I want to tell you what I know about your father." And it was a very generous thing, just she wanted me to know what she could tell me. And some of it was not very positive, but, she tried to explain why she thought he was the way he was.
Well, and, I think it's good when people are completely honest about the situation.
Absolutely.
I would rather know it all than just a part of it, or to have it mischaracterized as something that it wasn't. So, I want to know the truth. In other words, I can handle that.
And she told me the truth.
Yeah, I can handle it. And it sounds like that you were able to do that. Did you run across anyone I know that you said your mom had, of course, passed away, and that your brother or half-brother really didn't know anything about it. Did you run into anyone along the way that did know? Or was everybody kept out of the loop?
It's one of those don't tell anybody stories. After the book was published, or actually just prior to publishing or to completing the manuscript, I had one cousin, again, an adoptive cousin, who was kind of the matriarch of the family. She was the last, the oldest of the cousins, and I had never brought it up, and I said, okay, here's my chance. Let me call her, and hopefully I won't knock her off her seat when I ask the question. But we made our family small talk about how is everybody and what have you been doing, and then I said, I got a question for you. What do you know about my adoption?
Yeah.
And she never missed a beat. She said, I only know two things. She said, your mother was an ice skater, and my mother went to the hospital with your parents when they picked you up.
Oh, wow.
So, she knew, but she never brought it up. And a couple of weeks later, it was interesting. She called me back. She said, I thought of one more thing. She said, you were named after a man named Eddie Sens. Eddie Sens was a very well-known hairdresser and makeup artist in the movie industry. And she said, he's the man who arranged your adoption.
Wow. Yeah.
So later when the book was published, just so I wouldn't blindside any relatives, I sent copies to cousins, and two of my cousins on my maternal adoptive side immediately sent me emails saying, oh, we always knew. They told us to keep it a secret. We assumed you knew too. So they had been told more than I did. It was, we always knew. My mother said, don't say anything. And they didn't. They kept the secret. Yeah. And that's the way it was back then.
Yeah, exactly. And people could keep secrets back then and do it well. And to me, it's always a cool thing when an adoptive kid finds their birth family, no matter when it is, whether it's in their teens, in their 20s, in their 50s, whatever, it's always a really cool thing. It kind of brings everything together, and you are finally able to begin to piece together what you have always wanted. And I know that you refer to a lot of this in your book as being putting the jigsaw puzzle together.
Exactly.
And finding out who you are completely. I mean, we knew who we were, obviously, but whenever you find that other person, now you can complete it. You can complete the picture and begin to get the answers. What else would you like to tell us? We've covered a lot. We're running down here to the last few minutes of the podcast, and I want to make sure that you get your desires out there. So tell us whatever you want to at this point about your book, about your life, whatever. Giving you the floor.
I think it's important. You and I came from very stable backgrounds and environments, and we were very fortunate that way.
Right.
Our adoptive parents were the only parents we ever knew.
Right.
You referenced the kids who find out at 10 or 13 or 17, and you hear stories about people who find out when they're 40, and and putting this story together for them is not nearly so easy as it was for somebody like myself, or to accept as easily as it was for you.
Right.
Because you've been lied to or misinformed for years. So, so I do the disclaimer in that I was blessed and had a wonderful and positive experience, from the day I came home from the hospital through today, being able to chat about it like this. But, there are a lot of folks out there who were not similarly blessed because, they were misinformed or not informed.
Right.
And, so we're part of a happy portion. There's there are folks who are dealing with the trauma of adoption. That's a very legitimate thing. So
it is.
I think we need to be, folks like you and I need to be understanding of those people. I would hope that the people who have experienced those traumas are similarly, accepting of us and realize that, it could have been better. Unfortunately, it was not, for them.
Yeah.
But,
stigma. It's stigma, and there's this, and that can be applied to either side of it. The adoptee or whatever, whoever. It can apply. And I think we were both lucky. I really do, because we came up with that knowledge.
Adoption is a common thing. I think I've heard a number like 1 out of every 4 people is somehow touched by adoption, whether having been adopted, given up a child for adoption, having received someone into their family via adoption. So it's a prevalent thing.
Yeah. Well, it's in my opinion, and I have to say that, sorry, it's the way it is when you're dealing with YouTube. In my opinion, it is a better procedure than an abortion. It's my opinion. As an adopted child, I can say that because I'm happy to be here. So, that's...
Yeah, JD, I explain in my book, my mother had the opportunity.
Right.
At the time that her pregnancy was diagnosed, to 1, go home in shame. Number 2, place me for adoption, or number 3, though it was illegal, to safely terminate the pregnancy, and it was not in her heart and in her soul to do that, and she made another decision. And obviously you and I are having that conversation, so I'm grateful to be here.
Absolutely. Well, Edward,
and I'm grateful for that decision.
Yeah, me too. Well, believe it or not, we've come to the end of the podcast. I could go on with you for hours because we got so many similarities.
We do.
For anyone out there who has an interesting story that they'd like to tell, make sure that you email me at office@ustreamit.net. That's office@ustreamit.net. And we'll get you on It's Prime Time somewhere. Edward, I do want to thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. And, of course, we'll have all of your information up there for you. But thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for the time to share it with you.
You bet. Thank you.